So this is the question for Anselm Franke through the mediation of the camera. So the exhibition The War Earth is about a time where, while technology was supposed to close the circle between man and nature, the image of the Earth rise came to give a final reversal or turn of the screw to the movement of modernity, the rise of the subject above the horizon of nature is entering into the sphere of light and revelation history. This disappearance of the outside, the exhibition invokes on the coast of, on the shore of California, that the Earthrise epitomizes, thus seems to echo another disappearance on another shore, the one that Michel Foucault felt at the end of modernity, the disappearance of the face of sand man had carved for himself on the shore of history. So according to Foucault, this face of sand is the image of the process of modern episteme. That is the instrument by which the inside, the production of the subject, is actually what we could understand as a morphological process of the outside, making of the subject something like a wrinkle, a fold, or a pocket reversal, a local pocket reversal of the outside. So if we follow Foucault, if we can understand that the epistemological discontinuity Western modernity had established between the subject and nature, the shattering space of critique that dialectically bounds subjects and objects, was in fact a continuous process, which is precisely the question raised, I think, by the concept of Anthropocene, where the epistemological separation between the figure of man and its ground collapses, and where consequently the linkage between the production of knowledge and criticism, especially in the context of advanced capitalism, is radically transformed. So your text in the catalogue seems to end on this precise question of critique, that indeed cannot bear the modern dialectics of inclusion and exclusion that kept it running. You even call for a vertical move back to the background of planet Earth. Since I think this is exactly the point of the thought of the Anthropocene, I'd like to ask if you could be a little more specific on this question of the possibility to be critical today, especially when we think with art. So my question is the following. From your point of view, in a context where no one can say no to ecology, would you agree to say that the main critical matter at hand for art is not an exploration or implementation of ecological modes of relationality, but rather a navigation in the main space the Anthropocene opens, that is to say, the remains of the epistemological separation modernity handed down to us?
Okay, I think this is a very good question indeed. And it is one that I would always attempt not to necessarily answer theoretical, but with a certain practice, a practice that may be trying to focus on, as we do in this exhibition, the whole Earth, dialectical images. So it is less about rescuing epistemological separations that modernity implemented, then exploring or working at the meridian of dialectics, if you wish. And that also means to rescue dialectics, even if this word also comes with its own baggage, in which I would not buy into everything. I think the point is not to reject ecology, but to be very clear that we have not much models yet on what ecology means politically, other than that it used to be or is invested with this interpellation power of closing the circle by means of some urgency, like the kind of Peter Sloterdijk motive of change your life. But the matter at hand seems to me very much how do we get to negotiate structural conditions, and that is what I would mean by dialectics, the relation between a articulation and the structure that produces it. And I think the critical point is not to fall into the trap of a complete negation, because negation today takes place in an increasingly, I would say, probably clinical space, but to try to sort of move with this idea of the what I was just calling this meridian, trying to deal with the fact that, which is also part of, I guess, the thesis of this exhibition, that we have not actually entered as the whole Earth image and its messengers, such as the Whole Earth Catalogue and Stuart Brand, were suggesting a period in which all boundaries and distinctions would break down, but rather the opposite. We have actually universalized the boundary conditions, and that is a very interesting motive, which will, I think, take quite a lot of time to deal with. No? So it's a big difference to think of a space such as the one that you see in the exhibition, announced by people like Stuart Brand or Russell Schweikart, when he says in the orbit of Earth, in awe, inspired by this beauty and the fragility of this threatened but also harmonic planet, no frames, no boundaries. No? This in fact, it's a kind of universalization of the framing condition, which at the same time puts up new challenges and questions to politics. And what is politics? Politics is about the entry condition into a sphere of negotiation and into a sphere of speech, and into a sphere of status, of subjecthood status, not necessarily in order to rescue Foucault's image in the sand, but simply as a subject of rights, because there is no such thing as rights without a subject that bears it. So I would, in this moment, become less carried away by the kind of grand scheme, like the Foucauldian image of man being washed away at the beach, maybe of California under LSD, but try to insist on this that the universalization of boundary conditions, and that they're working at both macro and micro levels, which we have to break open. And the only way, since at least in a kind of curatorial fiction, which is useful to some degree, the only way to do so is to imagine that the modern era of time has also reversed with the turning around of the camera, and this meridian, meaning the dialectical optics, that is a kind of Benjaminian concept, that allows you to see the very making of these boundaries as systemic conditions that they have become today, kind of the calculuses and milieu modeling that happens everywhere, that has to be unearthed, if you wish, by historical narratives, kind of archaeology narratives, such as the one of the shores of California in the where the frontier morphs into circular form. So this is part of the answer. On the other hand, in art, I would certainly try to do a double move. On the one hand, art, which also since roughly 68, and what Jeff Wall calls the conceptual reduction has entered into this by now kind of quotidian use, the concept of the expanded field. So which often makes us forget that art still carries the systemic condition of modernity, but now transformed into mere quotation marks. So it's no longer necessarily bound to a clear institutional demarcation with an inside and an outside. It could also be everywhere, and but it's always with a quotation mark. So because if the quotation mark, for example, is not present, a calligraphy piece would be craft, while if it's quoted, it could enter a contemporary art biennale. These are the kind of systemic continuities that are absolutely crucial to understand and see them in their historical continuity, which leads in my curatorial tendencies, yes, to a certain embrace of modernist concepts of the institution, simply because I think that these are the systemic conditions under which art takes place now, meaning I would not necessarily embrace or do projects which further claim to expand and transgress, but I would rather try to use, yes, the exhibition and the institution as purifying machines in which it could, the only really amazing thing we can still do with these quotation marks and the institutional frames is to actually overdetermine signifiers, to enter a semiotic field where the smallest little detail matters and forces you ideally in some way or another connected with an entire set of aesthetic experiences, which is aesthetic experience is absolute part of boundary conditions, because it's exactly about the nexus of making and being made, and the entire affliction and affection of a body, just as much as it is about ideas and ideologies. So I would embrace a certain purifying quality, which one could say is in continuity. I think that the key questions also in other fields, in parts of the sciences, is not to completely give up on purification models and resolve everything in not further qualified relationality, sure. So the question is just, at what moment does it politically to what effects do we use certain tendencies, such as, is it at the given moment where basically we enter a field that is not defined by very restrictive distinctions, but rather by things like systemic privilege. So I would at the same time try to work very strongly against this, what both in other fields and in art has become systemic privilege, which is all about continuous forms of in and exclusion, but no longer easily addressed and named as such. So this double move would probably be another dialectical motive, embracing the modern purification heritage of institutions, breaking them on the content level as in archaeology along the meridian of dialectical constitutions of expressions, articulations, and structures, and at the same time trying to negate systemic privilege simply for the sake of being able to address and negate and take distance and be autonomous towards the very structures that create these privileges.